No Heroes Here, A Father's Journal. Written by Joseph Doty. Compiled and edited by Scott and Mary Ann Doty. Part 6.
Chapter 27. While I was recovering from the operation on my arm, Ed Brown moved in next to me. Ed was a paraplegic. The only parts of his body he could move at will were his eyes and mouth, and he could hear clearly. He was fastened in a type of bed, strange in appearance, that performed the critical function of rotating the patient to prevent bed sores from forming and to give the patient's body some exercise. Ed had all the reasons in the world to be bitter, and he was. He could have dictated a book on that subject and two others. One would be on the desire to live, and the other on intestinal fortitude. On the first day in the ward, he was heavily sedated and slept most of the day. Late that afternoon, when he awoke, I became acquainted with his voice's cold, biting sound. He was awakened as the orderlies prepared to change the position of his special bed. He rapped out orders like a top sergeant as they tried carefully to move him with as little discomfort as possible. I would have thought that being paralyzed he would not feel pain, but if he were not moved just so, it did hurt. His bed was constructed so that he could be turned from lying on his face and abdomen to the opposite position of lying on his back. After each of these turnovers, he would have to get himself together emotionally before he could converse with anyone. God, how he hated his situation. He repeatedly vowed that he would beat it if it took the rest of his life. If it were thought that he would accept being turned twice a day like a fried egg, well then, the world did not know the kind of person Ed Brown was. Ed never operated on a regular schedule. He would sometimes sleep all day and be awake most of the night, and then again, he might reverse the procedure. Ed would demand food at odd times and refuse to eat when the rest of us did. Here he lost a battle. He might be able to cow nurses and orderlies and tell doctors to jump in the lake, but when it came to the kitchen, he lost out. Never did I ever hear him say a kind word to anyone. A good morning would bring a look of disdain. I soon gave up, asking if there was anything I could do for him. If he answered me at all, it would be coldly sarcastic, but on occasion he would ask me if I had something I could read to him, pleasing me no end. Unfortunately, what I had to read was not what he liked, namely science fiction, which I did not like at all. My tastes were westerns and mystery stories with a bit of heavy stuff now and then. He and I had a couple of run-ins because of this difference of opinion on literature. One time I remember Ed had gotten under my skin about something or other, and I started reading a story I knew he did not like. He yelled at me to stop, but I continued ruthlessly. We made so much noise that Captain Loomis ran over, snatched the book from my hand, and hit me on the head with it. Then she turned to Ed and told him to shut up, or she would have him turned over on his stomach, which made it difficult for him to talk. He devastated the volunteer ladies who came to the hospital to cheer us up or perform some slight service like writing a letter. They soon learned to leave him alone. Miraculously, Ed discovered he was beginning to get some feeling back in his right leg. After some hard, tongue-chewing work, he could get some movement in the toes of that foot. The doctors and nurses reacted to this news as if Ed were the eighth wonder of the world. He received so much attention that he, who wanted none, almost went crazy, and it did not help his disposition one little bit, so I was glad in a way when he was moved to another ward. Another reason I was so happy to see him go was because he always smelled terrible all the time. A short time after he left, I began a series of physiotherapy exercises to regain strength in my left hand. It had gotten weaker after the operation to the extent I was unable to tie my shoes or wring out a face cloth. I was in the therapy room getting a massage from a nice-looking therapist when, to my great surprise, Ed Brown was brought into the room in a wheelchair. He was slumped over and held in place by pillows wedged between him and the armrests of the chair, but damn it, the guy was doing the rest of the job himself. I went over and told him how glad I was to see him looking so much better. I wouldn't have been surprised if he gave me one of his icy stares, but instead he said, "The next time you see me, If I'm not on my feet, don't bother to say anything to me. I saw him around several times after that, but respected his wishes and left him to himself. Months later, just before I left the hospital for good, I came upon him for the last time. Using a walking frame, he was laboriously walking along a corridor. He was just about able to shuffle one foot after the other, but he was on his feet, by God. I was not about to be put down by his sarcastic tongue, so I did not say anything. As I walked by, he turned to look at me, surprised, and said, "Hey, kid, how are you doing?" I mumbled something or other about being all right. As I look back on it now, I can only surmise that Ed felt he had the thing beaten and could spare some energy to be sociable. Chapter 28. After the operation on my arm, and although it was still in a cast, I was able to go home almost every weekend. Being in a cast made it difficult to change the colostomy dressings, but I managed. I was much stronger by now and could make the trip by myself. If I began to feel poorly, there was always someone with a Red Cross armband I could ask for aid. The first weekend I was home while I had the cast on, I awoke Sunday morning to find the cast and bandages bloody. My poor father almost went out of his mind when he saw it, and my mother would not look at it. Although uneasy about it, I managed to calm them down, dressed, and walked to St. Joseph Hospital to see if they could do something about it. My predicament brought immediate and excellent attention. I was put into a wheelchair and was transported to the emergency room. A local neurosurgeon was summoned to the hospital, circled by other doctors and nurses, and they removed the bandages and examined it. And of course, he just had to stick me with a pin to convince him of the injury's extent. Every time I saw a doctor for the next 10 years, I would get stuck with a pin. The neurosurgeon finished putting a clean wrapping on the cast when we learned the colostomy was discharging. Now they really became interested in me. Another doctor was called to look at this new development. He poked and probed me a little and asked me to tell him what I knew of the treatment I was receiving in the Army hospital. After they were satisfied, I was straightened away. One of them drove me home and waited for me to get my things together. They then drove me down to where I took the Staten Island ferry. As nice as they were to me, I could not wait to get back to Halloran Hospital to ensure the civilians had not messed me up. Home again, with the new cast and a whole week's leave, I found to my great pleasure that my old chum, Keith Tremaine, was also at home recovering from an unfortunate leg wound received in Burma. It was a piece of bad luck that his injury left him with a stiff knee, preventing a promising professional baseball career. I am unsure why we did it, but Keith and I devised a scheme to bedevil the civilians riding the city buses. It all started as we were returning home from a movie. The bus we got on was full. Keith was balancing himself on his good leg, and I was trying to help him and hold on with my one good arm. We were pushed and shoved as people got on and off at their stops. Suddenly, Keith became exasperated and shouted, "Someone had better give us a seat or else." At that, 5 or 6 people got up and offered their seats to us. They all looked so damn embarrassed that we forgot our anger and started laughing. The passengers must have thought we were suffering from battle fatigue and being wounded. The situation seemed so amusing that we got on and off buses for the next few days as we sought to embarrass the poor people of Yonkers, New York. Very likely, many people did not offer us their seats for fear of embarrassing us by calling attention to our infirmities. Unfortunately, the operation to repair the severed nerve in my arm was not a complete success. My arm was to be partially or permanently disabled. The next operation would be the one to get rid of my colostomy, and you can bet I spent a lot of time hoping for better luck. I had 2 visitors at the hospital on 2 successive days. I am glad they did not come together, as that would have spoiled my pleasure from both. I was lounging around the ward shooting the breeze with Dave and Meg. Suddenly my brother Jack was there. It was a heck of a surprise, for I thought he was still in Panama. Jack had been in the Army for 2 years before I was drafted, and spent most of that time in Panama's jungles in an anti-aircraft unit. The situation seemed so amusing that we got on and off buses for the next few days as we sought to embarrass the poor people of Yonkers, New York. Very likely, many people did not offer us their seats for fear of embarrassing us by calling attention to our infirmities. Unfortunately, the operation to repair the severed nerve in my arm was not a complete success. My arm was to be partially or permanently disabled. The next operation would be the one to get rid of my colostomy, and you can bet I spent a lot of time hoping for better luck. I had 2 visitors at the hospital on 2 successive days. I was lounging around the ward shooting the breeze with Dave and Meg. Suddenly my brother Jack was there. It was a heck of a surprise, for I thought he was still in Panama. Jack had been in the Army for 2 years before I was drafted and spent most of that time in Panama's jungles in an anti-aircraft unit. Jack was now a sergeant, had lost much of his red wavy hair, and had the yellow complexion common to those who had taken continuing doses of the anti-malarial drug atabrine. I was genuinely pleased to see him and made sure everyone in the ward shook hands with him. After a while, we got off in a corner and tried to talk. However, we had been apart 3 years, and the chronological difference in our ages made everyday talk difficult. Jack was out of school and working while I was still playing stickball in the street. One of the first to enlist after Pearl Harbor, Jack had his picture in the local paper with other boys like him. Frustrating was also the news that his kid brother had been wounded while he was sitting on a hilltop, hoping for something to shoot at beside alligators. Of these, quite a few were in the swamps between his hilltop and the nearest cold beer. My second visitor was my good old friend Bill Smith. Bill was not a big guy. He was turned down the first time he tried to enlist in the Navy because he was too light. He went on a milk and banana diet and tried again. This time he was accepted. I had known Bill since I was 7 years old. We had played ball together, gone to school together, and fought back to back on more than one occasion when attacked by our Italian neighbors. He was very imaginative and often made an afternoon that otherwise would have been dull and routine exciting. Bill had an experience in the Navy that was both heart-stopping and interesting. At the time of this experience, he was on duty as the radio telegraph operator of an ocean-going tug somewhere off the coast of New Guinea. An Army infantry battalion had managed to get themselves cut off from the outside world. It was in danger of being wiped out by attacking Japanese. Frantically trying to contact someone on their side in the war, the radio men with the besieged troops sent out a message for help in clear language. Bill picked up this message. Realizing the importance of the situation, he sent for the tug's commander. Quickly appraising the emergency, the commanding officer ordered Bill to stay on duty. At the same time, he relayed the situation to headquarters. Bill kept in contact with the troops until the Army could finally send help. Bill was on duty for almost 24 hours, constantly aware he was the only contact these soldiers had with any Allied force. Later in the war, now serving as a radio man on a landing ship carrying supplies to the Philippines fighting areas, Bill's ship was struck and sunk by a kamikaze plane. Bill had to jump overboard to save his life. Did I mention that he was visibly shaking during his visit to me? He was, and I sure did not blame him. Chapter 29. As my health improved, I could take advantage of the almost unlimited facilities of the hospital compound. On it were tennis courts, a swimming pool, horseback riding trails, movie houses, a large auditorium, athletic fields, bowling alleys, a gymnasium, different craft shops, and a German prisoner of war camp. I used each one to some extent, including the prisoner of war camp. That fascinated me no end and reminded me of my dislike for Germans, real or imagined. Often I would see a work detail of them around the grounds, and I would think that I could, without qualms, take up a gun and shoot them. On Armistice Day, November 11th, 1944, I was just leaving the auditorium on my way back to the ward when the hour of 11 o'clock was tolled out by the chapel bell. Everyone stood at attention as taps sounded in memory of those Americans who had lost their lives in the 2 wars with Germany. By coincidence, I had stopped by a work detail of Germans. I am afraid the spirit of the day and my long-festering dislike for them got the worst of me, and I started berating them for all I was worth. I am sure my tirade did not bother them. They likely could not understand me anyway. I did not feel any better for it either. To tell the truth, I became quite embarrassed at the attention I had drawn to myself. Feeling more than a little nauseous, I hurried away from them, and at the first restroom I came to, I threw up. After that, I satisfied myself by just glowering whenever they came into my view. We had the services of an Italian prisoner of war for a while. He was a tall, well-built man captured during one of the North African battles. His duty was to clean up the ward area. As he moved around the ward, some guys would kid with him a little. If he responded at all, it would be very polite. Mostly, he seemed very preoccupied. After he left us, we found out he had the reputation of being a regular one-man army during his combat days and was held in some esteem by the Germans. Some of the men in the ward wondered if he was the one responsible for their injuries. Perhaps that was why he was so quiet. He might have been thinking along the same lines. One of the shrapnel pieces that paid me an unwelcome visit shattered that piece of the vertebrate called the coccyx. The incision necessary to clean out the fragments and infection took a long time to heal, and when it was thought to be closed for good, it would open again. To facilitate healing, I had to spend a lot of time on my stomach with a bag of sand taped to each buttock. It sounds uncomfortable to me even now, except for times when it was necessary to clean my colostomy dressings. I lay in that position for days and days and days. In January 1945, I had progressed sufficiently for the doctors to allow me to attend a friend's wedding in New York. I had only a 12-hour pass, allowing me just enough time to go to the wedding and reception, get a night's sleep, and get back to the hospital. Unfortunately, I forgot myself and carried on a little too energetically. I was trapped for hours by a surprise snowstorm when the reception was over. By the time I got back to the hospital, I was worse off than when I left. The incision had reopened, and I was reported as absent without leave. I received some well-deserved chewing out from Captain Cross, and it was back to the sandbags again for a long, long time. Some weeks later, while entertaining a large group of visitors, including, of course, my mother and father, I was told by a ward nurse that Captain Cross wanted to see me for a few minutes. It was getting close to the time when my colostomy was to be closed, and he wanted to have one more look at my intestines. This was done by inserting a rubber hose through my nostril down my throat and so forth. It was not all that uncomfortable to do, although I suspect he anticipated a little trouble, as he had the nurse hold a basin under my chin all the while. The faces of my visitors had a surprised look when I came to them with a rubber tube sticking out of my nose. I made light of it, but I'm sure the visit was ruined for poor Mom and Dad. Those long trips from Yonkers took a lot out of my father, who, unknown to me, was suffering from cancer and was to take his life 6 torturous years later. I know the first couple of times I made the trip, I was all done in by the time I reached my parents' apartment. But do not let me detract from my father. What a guy he was. On my first 2 or 3 visits home, Dottie, my girlfriend, would walk down the long, steep hill from her house to visit me. At 17, Dottie had one of those finely boned faces that help keep the years away. Her attractive hazel eyes were clear. The circles under her eyes wouldn't tell you anything, because Dottie always had circles under her eyes. They were always one of the things that made her appear so striking. The circles almost looked like they had been artfully painted there for effect. She had lovely ash blonde hair. At the end of the evening, my father would walk Dottie home to save me from doing it, even though he was suffering from the pain of cancer. What a young fool I was, not to have called a taxi to protect him and Dottie from that long walk. Chapter 30. Unfortunately, the operation to repair the severed nerve in my arm was not a complete success. My arm was to be partially disabled, but at long last it was decided the time had come to close my colostomy, and you can bet I spent a lot of time hoping for better luck. Of course I was happy about it, but with some misgivings. I had, as did most of the patients, a double-barreled affair joined by a thin layer of skin tissue. Before the operation could be performed, it was necessary to remove this skin tissue so that the colostomy would be of one single opening. This was done by inserting a surgical C-clamp into the opening and slowly, day by day, tightening the clamp until the tissue was closed. I knew from the other guys that this was no fun. Walking around with this hardware in you was possible, but it was most uncomfortable. Besides that, it was difficult for the colostomy to discharge, obstructed as it was. I did not look forward to that at all. The big day arrived, and Captain Cross and his assistant came to my bedside, prepared with the usual rubber gloves with which they proceeded to plunge deep into my bowels. Ouch! Finding everything to their satisfaction, they applied the clamp into the opening and slowly tightened the screw. As I watched, the red of the colostomy turned a deep purple, and with a bit of anxiety the clamp was removed. There was a marvelous, lovely vein in the clamp's path. Tightening it shuts off the blood supply to that part of the intestine. In short, I did not have to go through the discomfort of the slow, painful procedure I had described previously. It would make the job more difficult for the surgeon, but I was the lucky one. So after 10 months that seemed like 10 years, my D-Day arrived, and I was operated on one more time. I was finally rid of the miserable thing that had saved my life. My recovery was good, and 7 months later, after eons of therapy and equal time for soul-searching, the dull, carefree, light-hearted days of the hospital were over. I returned home to my doomed father, my loving mother, and sweet, understanding Dorothy. I was discharged from the Army on December 5th, 1945.